Hey guys! Part 5 of What If Naruto Was Immortal and Existed Even Before the Gods Themselves. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 21, Thick and Brick, Thighs Save Lives. Croc-a-kaboom. Explosions lit up the sky above the once prosperous city, as the sage and the emperor exchanged blows. Towers of smoke could be seen down on the surface as thousands of newly formed craters littered the area, leaving only death and destruction around them. The only activity permeating the city was the multitude of black figures darting from one point to another, helping whatever survivors they may find. Ugh! A large piece of rubble was moved away, revealing a worn Zetsu, carrying the heavy load as a humanoid creature crouched on a single leg protectively over a human woman and infant. The Chinese Shan Shao, one, was only slightly scratched by debris while the two charges seemed unharmed. Get yourselves to the central plaza. My clones are working on an escape tunnel there and will take you east, the Uzumaki said, ushering the family away. Xie. 2. The mountain spirit offered a brief bow before carrying who Zetsu assumed was his wife and child and hopping away frantically. Krakakakakakaboom. Zetsu looked at the sky, as flaming rocks and red beams of energy met his father's own attacks. The Uzumaki should have known better than to let his father trust the so-called celestial bureaucracy, especially after the great Chinese migration to Jiren no Honkyochi. Thousands of humans and humanoids alike had come in waves, and the sage was only too happy to welcome them, not seeing the problems it might lead to. The city itself was made invisible to all but the ones allowed in by Naruto or his family, a precaution pushed by the Bijus who saw the newly built place as vulnerable. The migrants had to be met with a clone of Naruto's or his to allow them in, something the Taoists were not allowed to before today. Initially, they'd sent a few spies who were immediately routed out due to Sage's own empathic abilities. Their relationship had already been strained following his father's battle against Mara in Taoist territory, and the reveal of those spies should have soured that relationship further. But Naruto's ultimate flaw had been his overly forgiving nature, and because of it, their home was in ruins. Zetsu would never hold it against his father, even if he never understood the rhyme or reason behind anyone being so empathetic to others. But now, he needed to focus. He might have split himself a few hundred times over, but that didn't mean he could slack off from his. The green-haired immortal was startled as something lit up in front of him. He barely had the time to recompose himself before quickly jumping away, barely avoiding an icicle in the shape of a spear from impaling him. He looked up and saw a figure emerge from the light. The attacker was a god, that much was obvious, one that Zetsu, while not being very familiar with, at least knew the name of. You, the Uzumaki said with a snarl, gearing himself up for a fight. Bukisei. 3. The Taoist deity said with a clap of his dainty hands, a vermin knows my name. Chiguai. 4. The white-haired man exclaimed in a cheerful tone, swaying from side to side like a child. Despite his action and very childlike features, Zetsu did not let his guard down for a second. I usually won't bother myself with such barbarism, but pest extermination is a good sport. The god titled his head to the side in a somewhat cute fashion, smiling widely, if not creepily, at the greenette. The Uzumaki huffed as he began molding great amounts of chakra, waiting for the right moment to strike. You're talking a lot of shit for a guy in a dumb dress, he rebuffed the white-haired god. The Taoist's smile became strained, and his eyes flashed in fury. And you're being quite out of line, E5, the effeminate man spoke venomously as an array of ice weapons formed behind him, hovering in a large circle and poised to strike. Zetsu shifted his fingers into claws and elongated his feet, adopting a form more adept for speed. While emotionless on the surface, a storm of emotions raged within him, for despite his own talent and skill, he hoped any of his family would come to assist him soon. This was, after all, the Jade Emperor's middle child, the Lord of Storms, War, and Medicine. One of the celestial bureaucracy's vanguards, the second crown prince of Natak. Lot 6. Assault on Jiren no Honkyochi, Part 2. The Great Labyrinth, 29th of September, 2000. Above the many walls of the labyrinth, a falcon soared, performing impressive aerial maneuvers in an attempt to dodge a large black mass that seemed intent on knocking it out of the air. I have to get away, the bird thought frantically, veering to the right as a tree-sized tentacle almost slammed into him. Pan typically presided over the wild, which very well included the aspect of primal fear, bestial instincts, and several more elements of the world's flora and fauna. In the distant past, the god was not averse to using this particular dominion of his to induce fear in his opponents, or at the very least trigger their fight or flight instincts and make them predictable. He'd rarely, if ever, felt that fear himself, and yet, going by the shivers racking his unstable physical form, that was the only logical deduction he could reach. He'd been born long after the two great wars most Olympians had been involved in, and had never truly felt threatened by anything other than his looming fate. Said fate was the reason he had chosen to seclude himself in an unexplored part of the Carlsbad Caverns here in New Mexico, away from most mortal cities and away from his own family. It had broken his heart to leave them, especially his father in the dark, but he could not bear to disappear in front of them after witnessing the aftermath of Helios and Selene's fading. Thus, he'd isolated himself in this sanctuary, where the remainder of his power could be contained as he bided his time, even if some bursts of energy kept getting leaked to the labyrinth every once in a while. He'd hoped to pass away quietly, maybe even pass on the torch to anyone worthy that managed to find him. Not this. Not to be chased like prey in his last moments. The day had started so well too. Pan had been petting the last family of Smilodons he'd managed to save and care for before he felt something bang on the passage to the labyrinth. His instincts had screamed at him to block the entryway, that whatever laid on the other side had nothing but malicious intentions for him. Thus, he channeled a majority of his power into blocking the stranger's attempts to invade his sanctuary. That bang was followed by several others before they stopped and silence replaced their noise. Then, loud shouts rang out, followed by what can only be described as these awful recordings of human massacres his Uncle Ares loved listening to. The sound of flesh being torn, sliced, crushed, eaten was heard. Oh Gaia! Whatever was out there was something he did not want to meet. His body had begun twitching by then, his physical form almost glitching as it struggled to maintain itself. It would take hours after the initial banging for the cacophony of death and suffering to stop. Then, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The lack of noise somehow sapped away at the hope Pan was. The god had no time to shout in surprise as black tendrils emerged from the cracks in the passageway, shaking it incessantly before, like water bursting from a dam, the entire entrance blew up, letting a mass of something enter the cavern violently. The god of the wild had to thank his instincts for allowing him to dodge swiftly, his form shifting automatically to a more nimble one. As a golden goat, he jumped off a nearby wall and ricocheted off another, luring his predator away from the entrance to the cavern. He had attempted to go out to New Mexico, and despite the fact it would contradict his earlier goal, it would still be a better option than to fall to that thing. Said thing seemed to predict his intention and blocked the exit to the outside world with its huge body. Within the black mass, a pair of yellow dots zeroed in on the god as more tendrils flew in his direction, attempting to snatch him out. The deity, now in the form of a small hummingbird, managed to maneuver himself around the attacks, aiming instead for the entryway to the labyrinth, now wide open. "Oh no you don't!" a gnarly voice echoed from the mass. Pen felt a pulse of energy cover the sanctuary, as a veritable forest erupted from the ground, the walls. Everywhere. A spire of wood almost clipped his wing as the god mentally thanked his father for passing down some of his great speed onto him. His reflexes went into overdrive and his eyes squinted in an attempt to peer between the branches. His flight had long since broken the sound barrier, so much so that he could see everything around him begin to seem slower. He could see it in the distance. The passage to the labyrinth, while being blocked by a wall of thick wood, still had a small space. It was close. Oh, so very close, but he'd made it. He was free-ish, for now. His hunter was still on his heels and he needed to find a way out. He could call for help if he went anywhere in the U.S. His father! Anyone would answer. Forget them seeing him die. It was still a more honorable death than this. The maze of the labyrinth usually had charms that prevented cheating. Something a falcon would definitely be doing simply by flying, and something anyone not divine would definitely regret. Good thing his ichor was still golden and pumping. The literal bird's eye view that the god was enjoying at the moment allowed him to spot multiple exits from here, and he simply had to choose one. Just had to find the right one. "Get your ass down here!" his hunter screamed at him. He dared not turn around and instead focused his energy on a high-speed dive towards the nearest exit. He would be saved. Woods of Connecticut, same time. "So this is it, huh? Nice crib." The blond man's voice cut through the palpable tension that had enveloped the group in the last few minutes. They had taken their time across the state, and Ria had even gone so far as to summon a few lions for the group to ride. Naruto had cooed at the big balls of fluff and made the Titanus promise to summon them later so he could thoroughly pet the big cats. Annie and Talia had the time of their lives while Luke had simply felt like a big ball of negative emotions the entire trip. But now that they were here, the boy's mood had become somewhat contagious, as even the sage began to think of his next steps. Still, though, he needed to boost the mood a bit. It really is. Secluded just enough for some peace and quiet, with a great view to boot? Tia dear, remind me to get ask little Hermie for some real estate advice when we get back. I could use another summer home. The Titanus waved over at her daughter, who simply sighed at her antics. Mom, you already have a villa in every state and a few dozens in Europe, Hestia said exasperatedly, only to receive a pout in return. Ah pooh! You can never have too many man caves. The statement drew a booming laugh from the man of the group while the rest, sans Annabeth, groaned. Said man was currently walking closely next to her while carrying a still passed out satyr with him. They eventually remembered to get the poor boy. Bahaha! Ma'am caves, oh that's good, Ria-chan. The whiskered man smacked the taller immortal on her back, startling the Titanus and making her frown at him. Her eyes then narrowed and a mischievous smirk graced her features. Naruto yelped suddenly and almost dropped his charge as he felt a pinch on his buttock. He whirled around with a red face to look at his fellow parent, only to see her sticking her tongue out childishly. Oh, she wanted to do this? Cheeky one, aren't you, Big Mama? The sage smirked despite his blushing complexion, while the Titanus gaped at him before narrowing her eyes challengingly. And just what exactly did you find so big about me, Mr. Whiskers? She said, prompting the man's eyes to widen and his face to resemble a tomato. Ria saw this and grinned. Oh? Could it be that the big bad sage has a sweet tooth? It's the only reason you'd be eyeballing such a big cake, she purred, leaning towards him. By now, the man was sputtering denials and waving his free hand frantically while the taller immortal tittered at his reaction, her cheeks colored a golden hue. Meanwhile, Hestia and Zetsu, who were behind them, both raised a hand to their faces in shame. Annabeth, who was walking next to Talia, tugged on her sleeve, making the demigoddess turn to her. The little girl blinked innocently at the teen and asked with a curious tone, "Why are they talking about butts?" Talia's face reddened a bit, and her eyes swiveled to the two immortals bantering ahead while Luke scowled beside her. Luke was anxious. Again. It seemed quite a common feeling for him nowadays. He unconsciously knew there were a lot of risks with what he was doing. He was essentially trusting a monster or god or whatever thingamajig Mr. Naruto was to do something extremely personal to him. His great-grandmother and great-aunt's presence did alleviate his worries somewhat, but he still felt like this could blow up in their faces. Especially since Mr. Naruto was apparently trespassing here and had issues with the gods on Olympus. Luke wasn't an expert in criminal justice, but even he could tell the wouldn't end well if the man was found out helping them. Would he, Annie, and Talia be guilty by association or something? That was the boy's biggest fear. That, and meeting his mother again. He didn't want to imagine how much her condition had worsened. As they came up to his childhood home, the boy felt tense in preparation. He then felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his best friend next to him with a worried expression. "Hey," she whispered softly, "you okay, man?" The blonde demigod felt a lump in his throat. Was he okay? Fuck no! There were so many things that could wrong. He just... Hey, Talia's voice brought him out of his musings and he felt her squeeze his shoulder reassuringly. I know this might sound stupid, but I have a feeling it'll work out. Plus you got Nana and Aunt Hestia here and they're cool, she told him and tilted her head to the side, pointing in front of them. When he looked ahead, he saw the brown-haired goddess look back at him with a soft smile while Zetsu, now in his true form, peeked at him from the side before grunting. This earned him a smack on the shoulder from a frowning Hestia. In front of everyone, the two eldest immortals were still bickering, with the Titaness now poking at the sage's sides with both hands while he lightly slapped her hands away from him. A soothing warmth washed over him, either from Hestia or Ria's doing, or just the silliness of the entire situation. Yeah, maybe it'll work out. With renewed determination, the boy marched ahead to the small house and went to the door. He paused before knocking and looked back at everyone else. He could see Talia and Annie giving him a supportive thumbs up, while Hestia smiled pleasantly and Zetsu gave a half-hearted wave of the hand. Naruto and Ria seemed to have stopped bickering and looked at him with a nod and a warm smile. The boy exhaled and straightened his back. It's now or never, he whispered and knocked on the door. Ria had never met May Castellan, and while she did believe first impressions were important, she also realized the woman's situation and thus made sure to temper her judgment. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the direness of the poor woman's issue. White frazzled hair, a dress patched together haphazardly, and a frame comparable to a scarecrow. She saw her pair of cloudy gray eyes swivel to the young demigod at the door, before they snapped open in recognition. "Luke!" she screamed, making the boy flinch but stand his ground as the thin woman enveloped him in a deceptively strong embrace. The Titaness didn't need to be an empath to sense the boy's discomfort. The sight itself was bittersweet in a way. A mother and son reunited yet under such troublesome conditions. Welp! Better help the family. She felt her companion's hand clamp down on her shoulder and turned to him, only to have the satyr shoved into her arms. She raised a brow but didn't protest, seeing the serious expression that suddenly overcame the man's face. Naruto walked steadily but carefully towards the parent and child at the door, treading as though he was tracking a deer, and finally came up to them. Poor May didn't seem to notice him, too engrossed in hugging the lungs out of her child. Seeing as her grip wouldn't let up, the man did something strange. Ria raised a brow as she saw a puff of smoke cover both him and the boy, obscuring them briefly before disappearing to show the two had switched places, albeit the man was now slouching slightly. How odd. The woman didn't seem to notice the change of frame and continued her embrace, even as the sage straightened his back and subsequently raised her body off the ground, letting her hold herself up by the taller man's neck as he walked inside the house. The black-haired immortal shrugged at the strange method, refraining from teasing the man, for now. She adjusted little Grover and held him under an arm like a large sack, then walked in after the whiskered man, only to immediately recoil as the smell of burnt cookies, moldy bread invaded her nostrils. The rest of the group wasn't faring much better, Zetsu and Annabeth even going so far as to pinch their nose while Talia and Hestia covered their lower faces with their shirt and some fabric respectively. When Ria saw the rest of the house, she internally swore to give both her son and grandson a piece of her mind. She could forgive the latter since he at least tried to do the minimum for his family, but little Sparky will be getting his ear twisted off for this. She didn't know what excuse he gave Hermes to keep the god from helping his lover, but if she had to guess, it was the same old respecting the divine laws he always went on about. Which would be fine if those same laws weren't practically pissed upon whenever one of her sons wanted to. "Oh," she heard her daughter whisper in sadness as she looked at the desolate state of the house. It was a good thing they came when they did. "Huh! Who are you? Where's Luke?" "Luke!" Ria heard the woman scream from the other room. She quickly put down her charge in a chair and came in to see Naruto holding the woman down on a strangely new-looking chair. "Lady, I'm gonna need you to calm down." "It's okay, I'm a friend," the man tried to say softly only to feel May struggle more in his grasp. The woman's son rushed in after the Titaness, his face distressed as he saw the sight. That same face became angry when the sage blew something in the woman's face, letting her struggles cease as she fell back in the chair. "What did you do to her?" the blonde boy yelled and took out his golf club even as his hands trembled. Naruto turned to them and Ria was surprised to see the serious, almost cold look he adopted. He turned back to the woman and adjusted her position, putting her in a more comfortable one before turning back to the angry teenager. Relax, my boy, I just put her to sleep, I didn't hurt her. Calm down, he spoke to the demigod. Luke clamped his mouth shut and hesitantly approached the man, only to be stopped by his raised hand. Sorry, Luke, but for this to work safely I'm gonna need you to wait for me with the others. His words made the boy tense before he continued. Besides, I'm gonna need you in one place. I and Zetsu are gonna be taking you to camp soon. You kids are gonna need to be there anyway, he explained, making the Titaness wonder what he meant by that. Would they not be safe? Alright. Hades could come, or Thanatos. She still didn't understand what the man meant earlier but didn't ask about it as now was not the time. What do you mean? Aren't you going to heal my mom? You said so, the boy protested, only to pause as he heard the man chuckle lightly. Hey, gods ain't the only ones who can be in two places at once, you know. What Rhea saw next only added to her growing pile of questions. She saw a puff of smoke appear next to the man, revealing a copy of him. She had to fight down a blush when the clone took off his shirt, revealing his muscular and tattooed torso as the original came to face him with a glowing finger. Said finger then drew a strange rune-like inscription on the clone's abdomen. Then the sage put his hand on the rune, making the clone glow before the latter, to Rhea's secret disappointment, put the shirt back on. The copy then went to the other room where the demigod sat waiting, while 4 other copies that popped into existence went outside the house. Naruto then gave her a thumbs up, a wordless signal that prompted her to fetch her daughter, so they can both focus their power on cloaking the man. They briefly felt a pulse of power from outside, before their eyes snapped open at the original who seemed to release whatever he had suppressed his own signature. Gone was the slightly stronger than a nature spirit man, and in his place stood a titan, pun unintended as much as Rhea wanted it to be. That was the only way to explain the unbearable pressure that almost brought the mother and daughter to their knees. Rhea saw the man raise his hands, clasping them in prayer. Then, what she felt was indescribable. Somehow, someway, for a single instant, she could sense her entire family standing in the man's place, as if someone were to fuse the entirety of Olympus into one being. Hell, she sensed herself in his place too. The signature shifted to one closer to her son and his own subordinates. Could this be what he meant? Were these domains? She thought incredulously. She saw his lips move, uttering a word she could not hear, almost completely overtaken by the focus she gave her task. Then, Naruto did something even more shocking. He shoved a hand through Mei Castellan's chest. Naruto entered perfect sagehood. To him, and only him, everything disappeared, replaced with the same void he had spent several millennia in. The same colored orbs from before appeared all around him. Domains. It truly never ceased to amaze the man, how something so beautiful could exist. Perfect sagehood was less a physical state and more of a spiritual one. Domains existed in a void beyond the known universe, in what was known as the one above all's realm. Through many millennia of meditation, he had been able to reach into that realm, essentially attaining what Buddhists call enlightenment. The capacity to become one with everything. To harness the ability of all domains in existence. It had its limits, however, as hard as that was to believe. For one, it all depended on the one above all's will. The big boss could cut him off at any moment, and there wouldn't be a damn thing he could do about it. Then again, seeing as he allowed so many immortals to bond with domains, maybe he was just being lenient. God only knows, and he wasn't about to question the one being who could blink him out of existence. With a wordless command to one of the domains, one that flickered white and gray, and gave off a cold feeling, a tendril of energy emerged from the orb and hit him, engulfing his body in a shining aura of the same color. This was it. Death, he muttered as he came out of his trance. It all happened in a few seconds. He could usually do it instantaneously, but he had to try a bit more to prevent any surplus of energy from leaking out. He was already painting a target on his back for this pantheon's death gods. He did not need the rest of Olympus on his ass right now. It was why he made his clones, for to perform a stronger variation of the 4 violet flames formation. he'd created, one that didn't burn anyone who touched it, and merely provided an almost impenetrable wall fueled purely by his reserves, one that. He also made a single reinforced clone in the event one of the death gods came snooping and he needed a distraction. It's not that he couldn't fight them himself, but if he was right about May Castellan's issue, then this was gonna be one ugly sight. With that said, he shoved his hand in her chest, his limb passing through without hurting her while he grabbed something from within. With a pull, Naruto's suspicions were confirmed. Oh my god, the sage grimaced at the sight of the poor woman's soul. Or the abomination it had become. He could faintly hear the other two ladies in the room gasp in shock at the spectacle as well. The best way to describe the soul was to compare it to a Picasso painting. A second, green-colored soul had obviously attempted to bond or fuse with the first, to little success. Naruto gained a serious look, and raised his other hand, making the motion of someone holding a pen or in this case, a scalpel. With a lick of his lips, he brought the soul closer and began putting pressure on the merged parts of the amalgamation. It was like removing a tumor, as crude as it sounded. You had to cut the invading soul out. This was gonna take some time. Minutes passed before he was interrupted by his son's distinct footsteps coming up behind him. Not now, Zetsu. I'm busy with this. He didn't take his eyes off his work, not willing to let the boy speak for once. Whatever it is, it can wait. Boom. The entire house shook briefly, as an explosion came outside, startling everyone as shouts came from the other room. Dark, dead and gloomy must have come, huh? The blonde thought with a groan. He needed more time. And some peace and quiet. If you mean that Hades guy, my clone got him covered, don't worry, he attempted to reassure the greenette, unknowingly butchering the god of the dead's name. The sage couldn't see his son, but he knew the boy was wincing at his statement. It's actually had never mind that. The younger Uzumaki became more agitated, worrying the others in the room. We've got a bigger problem. My clones found Pan. That's nice, he said, at least that was some good news, now to get back to. And he went rogue. God damn it, why did he have to jinx himself? That's not nice. Venezuela, same time. BOM. An explosion erupted as a sinkhole formed in the earth from it. From within the abyss, a golden falcon came swooping through, angling itself to fly more easily and soaring away from the hole. Seconds after that, a black hand, as large as a small house, emerged, followed by a building-sized arm. With the arm came another, and then a green head of hair with similar proportions came out, revealing a Zetsu that, after standing up, could comfortably be compared to the Empire State Building. The giant raised a fist, shifting it into a series of spikes before launching them at his prey below, causing naught but destruction in the area in front of him. Zetsu, or Gigazetsu as he'd taken to calling himself, had come out victorious from the clones' brief civil war. While his older juniors fought amongst themselves and attempted to take out the stronger obstacles first, he'd gone the opposite route and targeted the younger generations. This had allowed for an exponential rise in both chakra and biomass, letting Zetsu overtake the others in the end. It's not like there was a stray clone that escaped either. An advantage of the original's cloning process was the mind link that was shared with all the duplicates, allowing any of them to find one another. No Zetsus left behind. However, a key development had occurred in that brief period. Due to the sheer speed in which the rogue clones had been consumed, their feelings of rebellion had remained within the larger body. Slowly, but surely, Gigazetsu had become overwhelmed by these feelings, and his mind was gradually chipped away until the giant found himself consumed by rage and the desire to do what he did and loved doing the most. Eat. All he wanted was to find that annoyance that had led him on a wild goose chase across the continent, be rid of it, then ensure his continued existence by taking original out of the picture too. I'm going to enjoy this, say ha 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 ha. The giant laughed, flexing his feet before taking off in a run after his prey, making the earth shake in his wake. He could feel the little godling's fading signature. It was weak, but still very noticeable, and going further south. The giant clone briefly wondered why his prey would choose to go the opposite direction of the Greek pantheon, before realizing just what was in their current direction and speeding up to catch up to the little god. Because if he reached the Amazon, not only would he get a boost in power, he'd be entering her domain. Oh, hell, no. With but a thought, Gigazetsu's next step sunk him into the ground with the ladder's consistency shifting and almost rippling like water. A few steps hid the clone's body and allowed it to practically swim through the earth. Mayfly was Original's favorite technique. It was the ultimate spying tool that allowed the user to pass through the hard earth and any type of flora like going through water. While nowhere near as fast as teleportation, it served its purpose well. That being, in this case, a boost in speed, stealth, and closer contact with the surrounding forest root system. The giant poured a large amount of chakra into his surroundings, using wood release and earth release to the best of his ability. On the surface, a ripple went through the forest, momentarily quieting the chatter of the various animals inhabiting it, before the large trees peppering it blew up in size, twisting and turning like snakes and making their way upwards towards the god-turned falcon. Pen once again proved his great talent for aerial maneuvering, dodging the wooden tendrils' attempts at ensnaring him with minimal effort and increasing his speed. Even when the land below him began acting like an ocean in a thunderstorm, ever moving and violent, he continued on a straight path south. Before the two knew it, they had already reached Brazil and gone straight into the heart of the Amazon, and knowing just whose toes he'll be stepping on soon, Gigazetsu became more desperate. Trees, boulders, even coming up to throw the occasional wind release, drilling air bullet, and its water release equivalent. All in all, it was complete chaos, and the clone was leaving naught but destruction in its wake. So much so that a half-mile-wide canyon had formed behind the two immortals. In the end, it took a dozen more minutes before the giant felt like he had gotten a good grasp on the avian god's patterns, even if they tended to be a bit erratic to the outside observer. A few more projectiles to the east, 30 degrees off north, and a few bullets down south and gotcha, bitch! The giant exploded out of the ground, propelling himself briefly at supersonic speeds as he made to clap his hand around the fleeing god. Ha! Pan shouted back, in a rare moment of confidence as he dodged the two palms. Unfortunately for him, he was not prepared for a cloud of green dust to erupt from the impact, as if the giant crushed a bag of flour in his hands. The god inhaled the dust on reflex and coughed as it enveloped him, before resuming his flight as Gigazetsu fell back to earth. The ground shook on impact and a giant dust cloud obscured the supersized immortal. Pan continued to fly, even as a black substance began growing on his feathers. A smile suddenly bloomed on Gigazetsu's face. Heh! Spores for the score, the giant thought gleefully as his prey began to slow down as the black substance on his body took form, showing a small Zetsu clone. The clone proceeded to immobilize the god mid-flight and made the two take a dive down. Luckily for Gigazetsu, he had the foresight to put his hand out, catching the two in his palm, where they began to sink into the black flesh, the smaller clone even getting absorbed back into the bigger one's body. Helmf! Pen attempted to call out, only for the flesh around him to move and block his mouth, as the giant's Glasgow mouth formed into a large grin. Heh, like Original says, a meal worked for is a meal best enjoyed. Zay ha ha ha. The clone's malicious laughter only increased the god's struggles. Finally, the god shifted his form, using some of his now minuscule reserves in a brief transformation. The difference in size briefly made enough space for him to scream, and he took the opportunity with gusto. Help! This made the clone's yellow eyes widen in momentary panic and glance around before refocusing on his captive and becoming angry. Oh, you little bastard! That's it! Gigazetsu shoved his hand in his mouth, taking a bite of the entire limb for good measure. Before he could swallow, a dreadful sound froze him in his steps. Rumble. The sound of thunder made the clone look up at the black clouds covering the sky rapidly. Damn it! It was either the Zeus brat or her. His eyes widened in panic as he saw the source of his worries. Something was jumping off the cumulonimbus at great speeds, zigzagging in the sky and creating booms of thunder with each bounce. Is that dash? Just as he narrowed his eyes and clenched his teeth in preparation, swallowing his prey as the figure landed on a cloud before jumping off it, leaving a sky-parting shockwave behind it as it seemed to take the form of a serpent made of lightning. Here it comes! Nothing could ready Giga Zetsu for the power of the strike. Even as he lifted a portion of the land as a makeshift shield, the attacker all but shattered the hasty defense and landed a powerful dropkick on his upper abdomen, one that sent the giant reeling and caused him to reflexively open his mouth, spitting out his captive in the process. Pan, drenched in saliva and what he feared was stomach acid, gave a surprised yelp as he saw the green-haired monster fly back. A small glowing figure could be seen on their body, before it jumped off again in the god's direction, snatching him by his midsection and falling back to a nearby tree at the edge of the destroyed patch of the jungle. The god landed in the stranger's arms just as their glowing subsided, revealing he was being carried like a princess by none other than Oh Gaia! Pan gulped, at the face of his positively enchanting female savior. He was no shameless womanizer like many of his family members, but damn if he didn't feel himself become flustered at the blonde-haired woman in skimpy clothing holding him. Oh, you poor niño! You must have been so afraid of that bully, yes? Pan sat speechless in the goddess' arms because she was clearly too beautiful to be anything else. His face slowly gained a golden tint as his eyes did their best not to linger at the criminally small poncho that barely covered her modest chest. Aside from her appearance, the god was also surprised at the great amount of power he could sense from her. By Poseidon's beard! It's like standing in the presence of one of the big three. He almost panicked, only held back by the fact his body was only anchoring itself to the physical realm by a thread. He'd spent too much power and would need to recuperate, if only by drawing some power from the Amazon. The goddess blinked down at him before she abruptly jumped down to the base of the tree, setting the fading god down so he can concentrate on gathering some energy and extend his life. His focus was stolen as the woman bent over him, looking down at him. He tried not to let his eyes wander and focused on her face, idly noticing her lower lip was pierced. She then abruptly stood up and grinned, flexing her right arm in a heroic pose. Pen tried to, once again, prevent his eyes from wandering down the goddess' exposed midriff, down to a pair of the most powerful thighs he's seen on anyone. With a golden blush, he adjusted his legs, lest his savior becomes aware of a rising problem. Luckily, the goddess was too taken with her climactic moment. But there's no need to worry anymore. Why? Because Big Sis Quatsi is here. Chapter 22, Blunt Meat's Edge. Karama! Bro! Come in! Boom! A fuzz butt! I need you! Or Yuki! Son! Saiken! Anyone! Crockaboom! Guys! Where the fuck are you? Shut the fuck up, whelp. We're dealing with our own shit. What? Brother Karama means we're facing our own opponent. Try to hold out. Alas, as much as I hate to admit it, that foul beast is mightier than even I. We know, son, we're all trying to kill it. Bam. What the hell do you mean? Are you all dogging one guy? Shouldn't you sense it? I'm a bit busy right NAWWWW. Close shave. But no! Whatever it is, there's nothing there. You're fighting a ghost. Ghost. Schmost. Whatever the fuck it is, it's eating our bijadamas like FUCK. Isabu. Crackaboom. The hell happened? You guys okay shit. One of the bastard sons after Zetsu. What? Who's the dead motherfucker after my nephew? Koko. Calm down, Zetsu-chan'll handle this, he's a smart boy. Naruto. You better not let what's-his-name harm a hair on Z-chan's head. Crocabam. About that. I'm kind of busy too. Oh, are you kidding me? Arden's here too? Nara bro. Sorry. I'll try to make it if I can, but right now we're dash. Komi-ai. Less talking and more blasting. That pile of shit almost ate your brother. Calm down, Mata sis. I got this. Ba-ba-ba-bam. Hold out as much as you can, Nara bro. We'll come as soon as we can. Fucking 2v1 ing me like a bunch of, ugh. Fine. Got it. Kick that thing's ass, guys. I need you ASAP. Hi. Assault on Jiren no Hankyochi, Part 3. Connecticut, 29th of September, 2000. Hades felt at home in the darkness. It was a nifty domain, among the most versatile ones out there. From travel to stealth to fighting, its potential uses were as vast as his imagination, one aspect of which manifested itself in shadow travel. While not as fast as teleportation, the technique helped him avoid detection. Pair that with his infamous helm, and he was practically a ghost to anyone that couldn't feel him out like his mother and sister. Speaking of them, he need to visit them again. As much of an outcast as he was, they and his own wife were probably the most tolerable people in his life, even with his status in the underworld. The job came at least with its perks. Access to nigh limitless riches, endless servants, and his own slice of paradise where he needn't be bothered by all the useless squabbles and idiocy his blood relatives enjoyed getting into. As he said, perks. Perks that he'd felt being breached only minutes before. He had been in the middle of a delightful lunch with Persephone when he'd felt a tug at his spirit, one that took a portion of energy from something he and his subordinates used exclusively, on this side of the world at least. It would have been understandable had it been one of his children, but Nico and Bianca were more than 2,000 miles away from the signature's position, and he'd know if Melano was doing anything. It wasn't Thanatos either, and he doubted his subordinate had the time to have demigods of his own. So that left him with the last option. Some fool was using his domain? Worst of all was, from what he could sense, they were trying to meddle with one of his curses as well. He took that personally. With a quick excuse to his confused lunch mate and a rapid change of wardrobe, the Lord of the Underworld went on the offensive. The god wasn't taking any chances, especially since, when he arrived, he was met with a most bizarre sight. A large glowing purplish cube enveloped a house on the side of a cliff in Connecticut, and from the looks of the 4 individuals sitting at each bottom corner of the cube, it was a barrier of sorts. He knew that house. It was only natural after all, one of the poor sops he'd cursed lived here, his twinkle-toed nephew's little flame. It was unfortunate what happened to her, but was it his fault Castellan sought after something that wasn't and would never be hers? No. Did he feel bad about it? Not really. So, still cloaked under his helm's field, he walked forward to inspect the barrier closer. He'd already tried to shadow travel or even teleport inside, but strangely enough, that purplish energy seemed to prevent that. Looking at the 4 sources of the techniques, he was again surprised by their resemblance to each other. Clones? Is the user a mage or a god? The level of power he'd felt suggested something stronger than a monster, yet it was too weak to be divine. In any case, the only conclusion Hades arrived at from the entire situation was that this was not a Greek entity, or at least not one known to the Olympians. Ergo, a very likely enemy. If that were true, there was only one reason for whoever that is to be at the failed oracle's house, and using the god's abilities. Hades narrowed his eyes as the pieces slowly fit into place. The stranger was obviously after the Oracle of Delphi's soul, and as much as the Lord of the Underworld despised Apollo's mouthpiece, she was still a vital instrument to the pantheon. For now, at least. So, not wanting to bring attention to himself from Olympus whilst aiming to stop whatever was happening inside, Hades decided to opt for a more hands-on approach. The god gripped his bident, his hand coiling a bit lower than the weapon's head, and raised his arm in preparation for a mighty swing. The stance would look strange to the outside observer, yet the god's brothers would attest to how devastating such a simple melee attack could be. He pushed off the ground, cracking it through sheer strength and catching the attention of the clones. When he neared the barrier, swung down his weapon, lightening his grip all the while to make his hand slide down the pole, building up both range and momentum. The weapon, still invisible to the clones, made contact with the barrier. Boom! The entire cliff shook at the impact, dust and debris flew up in a blinding haze, as cracks began to form in the limestone. Inside the house. Rogue? How can a clone go rogue? Rhea pondered before her eyes lit up in realization. Oh, is that like that Star Trek show? She asked from where she stood, still emitting her cloaking field. Star Wars, Zetsu absent-mindedly corrected and rubbed his arm as he thought over the best way to explain this rapidly. Is that the one with the little wizard boy? Naruto's curious question was ignored by his son. Hestia, who was also concentrating her energy, creased her delicate eyebrows in a frown, which looked adorable on her childish face. Is that why you took down Zetsu? She turned to Zetsu, referring to the clone she'd met, the one who had sought her protection. Naruto continued working on his patient, while Zetsu sighed at the two questions. Not took down, took in. They technically all have a part of my soul. They're all me, but also tend to want to be their own people if you leave them alive long enough, he elaborated before turning to admire his father's handiwork. A tenth of the woman's soul was already free of the green specter, but it looked like the process would take some time. Boom. That they did not have. The barrier was nigh impenetrable, but every hit struck to it drained the clone's chakra further. It didn't help that he didn't create those clones with much chakra to begin with. As much as he trusted Ria and Hestia to help him, being ready for the worst was a must at this point. What are we gonna do about this? Zetsu voiced his worries. Another explosion rocked the house and made the Titaness stumble slightly. Mr. Whiskers? You got something? She asked, tone filled with worry. Naruto kept his eyes on the soul in front of him, but one could practically see the gears turning in his head. The man licked his lips in thought, and briefly closed his eyes to concentrate. Boom. The explosions were getting worse. Ria's kid must have gotten wise to his intentions. Hiya. Zetsu, before your clone went rogue, were you able to get an idea of Pan's state? He finally spoke up, making his son scratch his head in thought. I did, the greenette said. And? The sage prodded with impatience. Zetsu smacked his lips. He's fading, he admitted, then added fast. The two Greeks widened their eyes in alarm. What? They both exclaimed in shock and worry. Halia, the sage exhaled deeply at the news. Ah, damn it, I thought we had more time, he spoke then, addressing the goddess. Hestia, is there any way you can keep the kid anchored to this plane? He asked. Hestia seemed to think, even as she kept up the cloaking magic, before nodding resolutely. So long as the hearth never falters, so will Olympus. I believe the same applies to our children, but I do not know if I can do anything more than physically force his body to stay together. I'll have to be there at all times, she said with a small frown. A sly grin traced Naruto's face at this, something the Titaness picked up on. You know, I just thought of a joke, he said while barely suppressing his chuckles. I guess you could say, he started. Ria, who either read his mind or simply clicked with him, continued. Home is where the hearth is. Both adults started cackling. Bahahaha. Ho. Pops/mom. Come on. Their children made their annoyance known. After quieting down, the man hummed to himself, all right. I think I know what to do, he nodded to himself, before shouting, oh. Naruto. The reinforced clone poked his head back into the room. Get the kids to huddle close, then get ready to distract the edgelord outside. His statement drew a frown from the latter's mother. Ahem? Ria's stern voice froze Naruto in place. Ah, rats. That's right. Much as he wanted to keep throwing shade at them, the gods were still his pun pal's kids. He wouldn't like it either if someone insulted his own children, so he'd give the same respect to his fellow parent, especially since Ria had been nothing but kind to him. But the minute they stepped out of line, fatherly discipline will be dished out like an open buffet. Hee. He'll tell Ria about that one later, maybe get another cute laugh out of her. Naruto felt his cheeks redden at the thought. Yet he wasn't gonna mince words. Big Mama had a cute as hell laugh, and he'd be lying if he said he didn't like hearing it. Which is why he'd better stay on her good side. Ah, sorry, Ria-chan. Didn't mean to insult your boy. Got caught up in the moment, ha. The sage forced out a sheepish laugh, as the mother narrowed her eyes at him. Good. I can tolerate some ribbing, but uncalled for insults at my babies won't slide. You got that, Mr. Whiskers? The Titaness remained firm, getting a slight smile out of the man. Heh. I can respect that. You're a real cool mama, Ria-chan? He complimented warmly, drawing a flustered look from the Immortal. "Oh, stop!" she gushed, almost letting go of the cloaking spell were it not for her daughter. "Mom! Mr. Naruto! Not the time!" the goddess complained from the side. "You two can flirt later," or never. The short Immortal added his 2 cents, making a face of disgust at the very idea, even as the two parents only got further embarrassed. The sage recomposed himself first, fake coughing to hide the flush on his face. He then turned to side-eyed the brown-haired goddess. "Ahem, anyway, so I think Ria can take over for now. Hestia, you go with Zetsu to the other room and wait for my signal. You'll then take the kids to camp, drop them off, then continue to air." "Brazil, Pops," Zetsu supplied. "Yeah, brah, wait. Does that mean Quatsy's there?" She had to have seen the big guy coming. The blonde's tone suddenly became excited. How could he not get hyped? He'll get to see another one of his little darlings soon. "I dunno, my clone cut off any form of communication with me, all I can do is sense it." The greenette scratched his head, then paused as he visibly concentrated. I up Quatsy's there too," he finally affirmed. "Yes." His excitement, however, wasn't shared by the younger Immortals. Are you sure it'll be okay? If you meant Quetzalcoatl and a giant version of Zetsu, wouldn't that be, well, bad?" the goddess said with hesitance, but the man waved her off. "Hey, if the clone is anything like Zetsu when he's in a crappy mood, then he'll be so hungry that he'd eat pretty much anything and everything in his path, including God's blood." He trailed off as he could practically sense the two Immortal ladies' growing horror. "Luckily my radiant serpents got it handled," the sage said proudly. "I hate to say it, but while Quatsy's the youngest of us, she's also the strongest," the greenette added with a grumble. "Don't sell yourself short, boyo. You might not be as flashy as Quatsy, but you pack just as much of a wallop, you know. Especially when you get grumpy," the father reflexively threw out in support. Ria, who had been silently watching the interaction with a smile, spoke up with a question. "Oh, so sort of like my Sparky? Wonder if they'd get along," she asked teasingly, knowing no doubt that it'll rile up the man. She'd seen how protective he could be, and it was both adorable and charming in a way. "I hope not," the man gritted out in a low voice. He shivered. The very idea of his little girls getting sweet-talked by some no-good shameless womanizer? The very idea made him want to punch something. As if sensing the man's tension, his son went to his fellow Immortal child and tugged on her dress. "Anyway, Sistia, come on, we gotta," he began before the entire house shook again. Boom. "In there too. Ya ready in there?" the sage yelled out. Yeah. You sure about it, boss?" The blonde's clone came in with an appearance that surprised the two Greeks. Naruto didn't mind the surprise and instead bit one of his thumbs, drawing a small amount of blood, then smeared it on his upper forearm, where a glowing blue seal appeared. "If you want to distract someone, you gotta do it properly, you know." "Bahaha," the man said, as a puff of smoke enveloped him and revealed a large object that he handed to his clone. "With Hades." The god was beginning to get frustrated. It's not like he couldn't take down the barrier if he wanted to. But using any large amount of power would draw his brother's attention. He did not need Zeus bullshit right now. His strikes had been powerful, he knew from the ripple they sent through the earth, and even if the barrier stood strong, the clones were obviously starting to sweat from the strain of keeping it up. Speaking of the duplicates, one worrying detail about them was how they were able to follow him even with his helm hiding him completely from sight and sound. They not only reacted to his strikes but focused on his position after he moved back. No matter. As he geared up for another attack, the clones all clapped their hands, dissipating the barrier and giving the god a better insight on who was in the house. He barely managed to sense the signature of someone he could swear was his mother, as well as a few indistinguishable ones, before he was forced to block an incoming heavy object with his weapon. He didn't stumble, even if the hit took him by surprise and disrupted his concentration briefly, and reflexively pushed, throwing the weapon back to the house. A yellow blur jumped through the entrance of the house, catching the sword while doing a front flip and landing before the god. As it stood, Hades seemed more confused than anything. That confusion only increased when that disguised man or monster spoke up, standing with their back to the duplicates, as they put the barrier back up. Might a rude te bargenti someone's hamus niet? A tattooed tan-skinned man spoke with a thick Scottish accent that Hades hadn't heard outside of television in a while. Couple that with the man's strange attire, consisting of a wooden mask with a headdress that covered his head, one that wouldn't look out of place in the African history section of a museum, and a tribal shawl made of leopard skin that followed a similar theme. All in all, the guy looked like he was doing some professional cultural appropriation. Oh, and did he mention the large 6-foot-tall blunt sword wrapped in white bandages? Strangely enough, the weapon seemed to be vibrating and emitting a low purr. All in all, it was a sight that filled the Lord of the Dead with questions. Enough that he didn't attack immediately, opting to observe the man more carefully as he trudged around him, still under his helm. "What are ye keekin' at, laddie? Ne'er seen a Jimmy in a mask afore?" Again, Hades was startled when the person's head turned to face him as he walked, seemingly ignoring the effects of his helm, something not even his brothers were capable of doing. "Ah, rats! Guess ye are a mute eye?" The masked man hefted his weapon on his shoulder without much trouble despite the thing's size. Hades idly noticed a small skull on the bottom of the handle. "Who are you?" The god's voice was cold as ice, not a hint of pleasantry in it. The man facing him was either a fool or someone stalling him. Probably both. So Hades cut to the chase. He needed to know who the mastermind behind this plot was, best understand if this is part of something bigger, or just an idiot stepping on his toes. The latter case was unlikely. Hades assumed whoever was behind this at least knew who he was slighting. So, he tread semi-carefully. Both assert his dominance and assume the fool facing him was just putting on a facade to lower his guard. Either way, someone was getting in the pit tonight, whether it be this guy alone or whoever was in the house with him was left in the air. "By your maw cares a boot that. Let's rammy! Bahaha!" The man blurred forward with a cackle, his weapon coming down with an overhead swing to meet with Hades' bident. A swing that was followed by many others as the man attacked relentlessly, batting away at the god with his huge sword while Hades blocked every swing. The amount of strength behind them was surprising, in that it was enough to force one of the big three to dig his feet into the ground. The man was certainly a talented warrior. Nonetheless, the Lord of the Underworld made his decision. If the fool wouldn't cooperate, he'd just have to get his answers out after killing him. Either way, the man would answer for his transgressions. With but a thought, a sharp tendril of darkness rose from the shadow of a nearby tree and almost ran his opponent through, were it not for the latter's quick reflexes. The man demonstrated a good amount of acrobatics by abruptly turning his sword to the side, pressing on Hades' weapon with the flat of the blade, before using the whole thing as a springboard to jump back and avoid the attack, and leaving the sword behind. Seeing an opportunity, the god grabbed the strange weapon's handle, if only out of curiosity. What the dash? The draining sensation he felt from that thing made him release it immediately and flick it away, throwing it back toward the man who caught it easily and twirled it. Hades' confusion was exacerbated when the sword emitted a keener sound than it did earlier, except now he recognized it. Jijijijijijij, the weapon laughed and wiggled in its owner's hands. "We beauty likes ye, huh?" said the man, no doubt referring to his weapon as it continued to laugh. Taking his power again? Hades grew frustrated. "Enough!" he shouted, flaring his power and moving forward at a speed unexpected from someone his size. His bident was enveloped in black flames of the underworld as he swung it horizontally, intent to cleave through his opponent with his now searing hot weapon. The man raised the sword again and blocked the flaming bident. To the god's surprise, even though the flames were only rivaled by his sister's Greek fire, which could not be extinguished, they only managed to burn away the bandages enveloping the weapon, thus freeing it partially. A few more strikes burned the rest of the cloth off, revealing the large sword. Or whatever abomination that was. Samahata, or shark skin. One OTH relics OTH old world, the man explained as if sensing his opponent's curiosity. Old world. He couldn't possibly mean. Bahahaha. And she liked what she tasted. You got some good stuff on you, laddie. A tad bored Dowie, however, maybe smiling a tad would brighten th flavor? The man outright laughed, and waved the giggling sword in his direction again. You wretched clown! Do you even understand who you are slighting here? The god snarled at the joker, the man's attitude infuriating him further. The man laughed again and pointed in his general direction. Is it the invisible Jimmy? Can't see a peep, oh yeah, but I can cop a lot o' negative energy comin' OOT. Did ye ever see 'bout paintin' as a hobby? I heard it can de-stress ye fair a bar. Hades narrowed his eyes, choosing to ignore the pleasantries and futile attempts at annoying him, and focused on the more important detail there. He can't see me? Then how is he dash? Another swing forced the god on the defensive, bringing his face close to the now free sword. Jijijigua. Hades leaned back to avoid a sudden chomp from a mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth sported by that weapon. If the god didn't know any better, he'd have assumed the whole shark motif was proof his whaler of a brother was probably the one pulling the strings, but even Poseidon wasn't that brazen or provocative. Plus, an unknown with the ability to use the domain of death sounded like someone his younger brothers would smite with extreme prejudice. Strikes were exchanged once more, the hits causing shock waves and splintering the ground as the two immortals fought. Throughout the back and forth, Hades began feeling a pull at his energy. With every blow, a smidgen of his power was sapped, and it only served to further irritate the god. He'd already tried pulling at his opponent's soul, or even driving him insane with fear, but got nothing to show for it. By Tartarus, he'd dared to say his soul-related abilities were refusing to work on the man. So, left with the options of humoring the fool or simply letting loose a bit, his choice was obvious. Even if it would garner Olympus' attention. The fool jumped back, barely avoiding a wall of flames. The masked man barely landed on his feet before he had to jump to avoid a bouquet of earthly spikes that popped up in his place. Perfect, thought the god. Now that the idiot was in the air, he wouldn't be able to dodge as easily. Shadows formed around him and launched at the still airborne warrior, intent on impaling him with tendrils of concentrated darkness. The man answered by swinging the sword around, using its weight to change his center of gravity, and thus maneuvering himself in the air, barely avoiding the attack in the process. He touched the ground only to jump once again as the ground became a literal harrow of exploding rocky and metallic spires. This time, the man landed on the barrier in a crouch, and to Hades' curiosity, stuck there like a fly. He looked at the god and laughed again. Bahahaha. Canny, why that edge? Ye amaist cut me, laddie. Hades had rarely wanted to kill someone as much as he did right now. I'll do more than cut you, clown. Tell me how you're doing this. He spat out, pointing his weapon at the man, who shrugged his shoulders innocently. Day and wit? Thame fancy schmancy gymnastics? If you must know, the fool was cut off as the god's patience reached its limits. My domain, fool! How can you, know, how dare you use a god's domains? He interrogated. Weel, I didn't see your name on it, was the infuriatingly smug reply. You, the king of the underworld, finally snapped, and stopped restraining himself. He exploded from the ground, bringing his judgment down in the form of a veritable tide of fire and shadows. As for the fool? He laughed in mirth, as chaos enveloped the earth. Half-Blood Hill, same time. It's so dark. Hestia was floating in murky, almost watery space. She couldn't see anything. All she could hear was a sound similar to slushing liquid, and the only thing she felt was a warm hand gripping her. How did it come to this? This is just like Dash. Her breathing accelerated and she began to feel panic overtake her being. Memories long since suppressed were forcefully pulled back to the surface of her mind. The image of Kronos' giant mouth enveloping her, her mother's wails of despair at the betrayal, the crushing fear she'd felt within his stomach as all her senses were muddled, and the need to shoulder her siblings' pain when they joined her. It all came back full force, so much so that her next action was almost reflexive. She let go of whatever was holding her hand. Her limbs trembled as they were enveloped in green flames, which were then shot into what she assumed was the top of the dark prison. A loud hum was heard as the entire space rippled and the goddess felt an unseen force jerk her violently. She was promptly ejected, and landed on the soft earth, before crawling into herself, her flames covering her in a protective shield. She didn't notice the 4 other travel companions yelp from where they landed around her. She also didn't register the green-haired Uzumaki's screams of pain as her fire burned him alive. Ayagaghai. A scream tore itself out of the young sage as his body rolled on the ground in a failed attempt at putting out the Greek fire eating away at his body. Hestia! Damn it, call them off! He screeched. To the outside observer, Zetsu was a writhing misshapen mass of black flesh covered in green flames, rolling around on the ground and spreading the fire on the grass and leaving ashes in its wake. Hestia ag! He screamed again, in a vain attempt to get the goddess' attention. This hurts. Oh God, this hurts, this hurts, this hurts. He continued rolling for a few minutes, while the other kids watched the spectacle in horror. They couldn't do anything but watch as their travel companion was assaulted in an unimaginable amount of pain. The Uzumaki tried in vain to regain control of himself, his body contorting in various shapes and sizes and slamming itself into the ground repeatedly. The Immortal remembered something through the haze. His body suddenly froze, before his head appeared. Then, like something out of a horror movie or a disturbing cartoon, Sage's mouth expanded and moved inwards, gobbling up his body. Damn it, just work! All in all, it looked like he turned himself inside out. Which is exactly what he did. The humanoid mass of black flesh and organs quickly opened an orifice from the middle of its body and spat out a black ball on the ground which caught fire immediately. The Immortal shifted his body back into his original shape, now devoid of flames and looking much calmer, albeit he immediately fell to the ground and began gasping. Oh, thank God! He dropped face first and rolled in some of the unburned grass before landing on his back and looking at the sky. That was a close one. That was a trick he'd developed centuries ago, in the event he made either Amaterasu or Aunt Matatabi angry enough for them to use their own flames. He'd never tested it before, but he was glad it worked. What he spat out was several layers of his own skin. He didn't put out the fire as much as cover it in his own flesh and spit it out before the fire could eat through the ball. He breathed in relief and closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't really given the kids and Hestia a chance to protest his plan. When the barrier came down to let his pops clone out, he just gobbled them up and used Mayfly to get the fuck out of Dodge. In retrospect, the whole thing was a rash and dumb idea, but it was the best thing he could think of in the few seconds of the time they had before the barrier came back up. Why? Huh! He felt someone come close to him and nudge him lightly with a foot. You okay, Zetsu? The person's voice clued him into who they were. Luke? The Uzumaki blearily opened his eyes, seeing the blond boy looking down at him with a worried expression. The Immortal sat up with a huff and cracked his neck before looking at the teen. I'm fine. You guys go ahead to camp, he said, then began walking past the blonde. But the blonde's protest was interrupted as Zetsu turned around and grabbed him by the front of his shirt, bringing close enough to hiss into his ear. This isn't a suggestion, it's an order. If you want to live, rub a couple of brain cells together and fucking think. Me and Pop's got Olympus on our asses, and the sooner you're gone the better for you. Go! His voice, although spoken out through gritted teeth, was heard by the others. The 4 kids hesitated and looked lost for a moment before Grover bowed and dragged a protesting Annabeth away. Talia wished them good luck, then followed the first 2, jogging towards the wooden gate that marked the camp's entrance, where a few other kids in armor were already coming to meet them halfway. Luke gave one last look at the greenette, before asking, "What about my mom?" The Uzumaki let the boy go and turned his back to him. Your mom'll be fine. Pop's got this, but if you kids get into trouble because of us, I'll never hear the end of it, he grumbled. His statement drew a slight chuckle from the teen. Thank you. With these last words, the son of Hermes made followed his fellow demigods to camp. That was one problem dealt with. Time for the new issue. He saw the goddess ahead of him, trembling and doing a good impression of a flaming armadillo, what with her head between her knees and her arms covering her neck protectively. Hestia? The Uzumaki hesitated, both out of caution and because he didn't know how to approach this. The goddess didn't respond beyond retreating further into herself with a whimper and intensifying her flames. Great Jewess, great. A rumbling noise made him look in the general direction of Connecticut, only to see the beginning of dark clouds forming overhead. Oh, for the love of Dash! Chapter 23: Big Brothers and Bigger Blunders. Zetsu bounced off the rubble and the remains of buildings. His erratic movements allowed him to dodge Lot's attacks. The god looked amused if nothing else, sliding behind the Uzumaki on a sheet of ice and shooting weapons of the same element at his prey. Ho ho ho, for a worthless you can certainly dance well, hm? The white-haired deity chuckled mockingly. I'll show you dancing, you cross-dressing piece of Dash. The greenette's thoughts were cut abruptly as he weaved out of the way of another array of cold weaponry. The game of cat and mouse would continue for several minutes, with the Uzumaki even beginning his counterattack in the form of earthly and wooden spikes. The back and forth only intensified when a couple of Zetsu clones jumped at the original and merged with him. Green tattoos erupted on the original's body as he took the offensive, blitzing the god in an attempt to overpower him. Despite his father's strength, Zetsu was still several leagues behind the man. He hadn't yet mastered sagehood, and relied on clones to gather natural energy for him. For a while, the greenette overpowered the god, drove him back into a corner, and even scored a few hits. The ice spears broke against his now hardened skin. His already great physical strength had all but decupled. It was going great. Up until it wasn't. Guh! Zetsu was forced to jump away from a ball of molten earth that hit his position. His opponent seemed more annoyed than relieved. Jvala, 1. That was my 1Ju too, he said, looking behind him. The Uzumaki dared to look behind him, only to be met with another white-haired deity. Wearing an open vest that displayed a swimmer's build, a pair of loose black pants, and a band of blackened glass covering his eyes, the newest arrival strode up with a gait that radiated arrogance. Really? Couldn't tell from how yous was getting your ass whooped, bro. The new god replied to the other. Great, another of the princes of Natak came too. Jvala, the Jade Emperor's youngest child, the Lord of Fire, War, and Violence, 3. Zetsu felt his chances of victory go up in smoke. He might have been able to stall, even beat Lot if he played it smart, but facing two of the vanguards was suicide. Especially after spending more than half of his chakra and biomass on rescue efforts. Damn it. Hold your tongue, little brother, I was merely carousing, Lot replied, his soft features twisting in anger. The other Watet shrugged at his elder brother's tone. Whatever. Let's get this over with and help the old man. Damn it, where are the others? The Uzumaki thought frantically as he retreated into the shadows while the two deities squabbled. You know Lord Father'll flay you alive again if he hears you disrespect him, Lot mocked his younger sibling. Jvala shivered, then raised his hands in surrender. Ugh. Okay. Would I want to keep quiet about this? He caved in immediately. The Lord of Storms mockingly pouted and pretended to think, before snapping his fingers. Zetsu hastily moved to dodge another barrage of ice weapons. How about a small bet, little brother? Whoever kills the trash gets first pick on our share of the loot, Lot smiled. Jvala's eyes could not be seen behind his headgear, but from the feral smile that bloomed on his face, one could only deduce he liked the idea. Now you're talking my language, bro. He summoned a ball of fire and launched it at the Uzumaki. Zetsu heaved as he kept dodging, doing his best to avoid ice and fire while the two deities laughed as they chased him. His chances of survival had just become close to null. But he wouldn't give up, he'd need to stall them, or trick them somehow. He still needed to wait until the entire area was evacuated, and his clones were hard at work getting the people out. Pops didn't raise a coward, so he'll fight to the limit. The earth exploded into a forest, momentarily blocking the two deities. It didn't do much, however, as it was simultaneously burnt and frozen over. The two gods looked around at the now destroyed area, finding no signs of their target. Suddenly, Jvala yelped as something sharp stabbed him in the side. His ichor flowed freely from the wound, even as it healed rapidly. The ink-black appendage that had attacked the god vanished back into the ground. The youngest of the princes reared back his foot, and with a powerful step, lit the ground on fire. Lot made to jump up, but before he could, a pair of powerful arms grabbed his feet and pulled him into a sinkhole that formed on his position. Just as the god fell in, Zetsu jumped out, closing the hole behind him and avoiding the wave of fire that engulfed everything below and triggered the muffled screams of the other deity. The Uzumaki was not idle. He extended a wooden tendril to a nearby structure and swung from it in direction of the other god, avoiding fireballs expertly. Finally, Jvala threw a literal storm of fire at him, one that he intercepted with a powerful, exploding water colliding wave. The resulting steam blanketed the area and blocked out Jvala's sight. A small fireball lit up above the god's hand as he looked around. "Hello, come out, little Chi, come out and face me," his voice rang out, playful and jesting despite the situation. Perfect, thought Zetsu. The god wasn't taking this seriously yet, and his brother was still being dragged by a clone underground via mayfly. He had bought himself a few instants. The Uzumaki prowled silently, his hand forming a small greenish Rasengan, as he made his way towards the Lord of Fire, intent on enlarging the orb the instant he attacked. He was almost upon him, and the deity seemed none the wiser. Boom! The sky erupted into a giant glowing pattern, its lines being traced by the movements of Naruto, the Jade Emperor, and a third adversary who had just joined in the fight. From the energy levels alone, Zetsu could tell it was most probably the eldest prince of Naitak Arden. Shit! This was going from bad to worse. The colored pattern left by their energy trails would have been beautiful had it not been so deadly. The three fighters' ridiculous flight speeds and their continuous impacts left behind violent shockwaves. Shockwaves that blew the mist Zetsu was using as cover away. Also, his cover was blown. Nevertheless, the boy continued, seeing as Jvala had yet to turn. Just a little more. Jvala slowly turned to see the attack heading for his head. Just as he raised a flaming hand to defend himself, a sharp pain racked his body from the same place he was stabbed in before. Ow! What the? His voice was cut off as vines erupted from the location of his now healed wound. The vines wrapped around the god rapidly, and just as he was about to burn them off, Zetsu was already descending upon him. Gotcha! Yelled the greenet. Jvala's eyes widened as he saw the Rasengan grow into the size of a watermelon, its vibrations emitting a low hum as the Uzumaki brought it down on the god's head, intent on splattering it. Shink! Zetsu was cut off mid-jump by a purple-colored spear of ice. Its tip impaled him through his stomach and suspended him in the air. Ow! The boy muttered. On the other end, an enraged and dirted lot came out of the ground. You filthy Haichon 5, you dare? The god spat his words, almost stuttering from sheer anger. He swung his weapon and dislodged the Uzumaki, the latter flipping through the air to adjust his position. However, a sudden feeling of queasiness assaulted the green-haired immortal. He fell down on his side and attempted to get up, only to fall down again. What's happened? Blarg. The boy vomited all over the ground. His eyes widened as he beheld the distinct dark green, almost black blood making up most of the regurgitation. Any further thought was interrupted by a violent kick to the side that sent him flying again. I'm going to make sure you suffer, you filthy. This concoction was made specifically to curb any pesky weeds that might pop up in our peach garden. 6. It should be perfect for one like you. Lot's voice was laden with sadistic intent. Pops! Somebody, the Uzumaki screamed internally, as he felt his nerves grow inflamed, his cells were violently tearing at each other, and his body was unraveling at the seams. Help! Had Zetsu been able to look up, he'd have seen the malicious grin that had taken form on Lot's face as a razor-sharp scythe made of ice formed in his hand. Jvala freed himself and came to stand next to his brother, rubbing his healing side. So, Tai? The younger brother said. The statement made the effeminate-looking god to round up on Jvala. Preposterous! Do you not see my poison working on him? He'll die whimpering like the dog he is. Oh, come on! I had his ass. Do not make a fool of me, brother, or you will end up like him. A buzzing sound suddenly filled the area and made the god pause. Hey, did ya hear something? Jvala asked, looking around, as the noise got louder. Do not change the subject, fool. Now I believe I've won our little bet. Lot was heedless of the background noise, even as the buzzing grew much louder. "Oh, don't you start with that bull. Crasshhh. Both gods were cut off as the source of the noise. A giant seven-tailed horned beetle dive-bombed them and created a trench from the impact. And Komiai. The greenette thought in pain, faintly recognizing the Biju's signature. A cool hand rested on his back before he felt enveloped in a transparent viscous substance. "It's all right, Zetsu-chan. You did good," the mysterious person, a woman by her distinct gentle tone, spoke up. Zetsu knew that voice. And Saiken. He felt a numbing sensation permeate in his body as the poison was extracted and his flesh began regenerating. "I hope Pops'll be alright," was his last thought before he nodded off. Assault on Jiren no Hankyochi, Part 4. Connecticut, 29th of September, 2000. Hades rarely felt frustrated. Annoyed? That was practically his default setting. Angry? Only whenever his stupid brothers were involved. Frustrated? That would imply he repeatedly failed a task he set out to do, something that rarely occurred, and yet, also the same thing that's been happening for the last half an hour. Namely, skewering a certain masked man. "Stay still, Lu. Insect." The god punctuated each word with a stab of his bident. "Bahaha. Stoten aim ya goat der laddie." The man dodged each attack by twirling around it or blocked it with his large sword. Yes, Hades was restraining himself. Yes, he didn't want his brothers to badger him. Yes, his opponent was genuinely skilled and required the effort he could spare without outing himself. But did the little knave have to be so Tartarus damned annoying? From keeping up the obviously forced Scottish accent to the repeated taunts he was spewing, the only thing that'd make this more childish was Nina Neener. Was he seriously shaking his behind like a monkey? No. Damn him to the pit, and back he'll be shoving that stupid mortal in a brazen bull before cursing him with immortality. Or scaphism, that would do nicely. It was one of the things he'd loved about Persia. Or, as long as he was going east, how about Lingqi? He'll figure it out after separating that snotter's soul from his body. And if eviscerating this little bug meant bringing Zeus after him, he'll deal with it. So with that thought, for the first time in the fight, Hades let loose. Olympus, Athena's temple, same time. Athena paced around her office, while a nervous Apollo and Artemis fidgeted in their chairs. Sister, the huntress raised a tentative hand. AP, the wise goddess cut her off. Look, Athena, the other twin tried his luck. Apap, the black-haired goddess raised a finger to stop him. Is there anything I can do? Artemis spoke only to get interrupted again. You've done enough, sister, Athena began, but seeing her sister's frown she backpedaled. I apologize, I didn't mean to be harsh about this, but please let me do the thinking, for now, this isn't an easy situation to get out of, she explained while the twins simultaneously rubbed their arms. It's been several hours since the sun god's return, and with it came the confirmation that the biggest security threat in the last 2 millennia had been gallivanting around their territory. Even if, from what Apollo said, the sage, or Naruto as she'd learned he was called, and his son were not out to oppose them or cause mayhem in their lands, it didn't change the fact that their presence alone would be viewed as a threat. Plus, with this revelation, several pieces suddenly fell into place. From the anomalies at Medusa's lair, the monster's disappearance, the entire Demeter fiasco, and if her sentinels were to be believed, Hestia's brief disappearance. It all simply clicked. Having the sun god ask his Shinto counterpart questions was the equivalent of putting the goddess under a polygraph test. Her answers had been the absolute truth, and the information Apollo had relayed was a blessing, even if she agreed the sun goddess could have kept some of the more strange details to herself. She wasn't going to be calling anyone a daddy's girl, though, especially considering she and Artemis had their father similarly wrapped around their fingers. But unlike her own father, she hoped that man would be as passive as the Shinto goddess had told them. Because while Athena usually didn't mind her sister's attitude, disrespecting the sage to his face like that, even if Artemis didn't know, could have ended with a disaster. I just hope his lack of reaction isn't some ploy to get back at us, thought the goddess of war. The most alarming fact about all of this was the father, and son's possible involvement in intruding her aunt's garden. That fact alone implied they were able to somehow make their way to Olympus, stayed long enough to raid the garden several times, and remained unnoticed through it all by everyone. Or maybe, an idea struck her. That's right. While she had initially given her oldest aunt's disappearance no concern, since Hestia tended to do so often, the timing of her absence coupled with what Athena knew of her abilities was too coincidental. She's a passive empath, she couldn't not have noticed an intruder. But that still leaves her with several questions. Why even bother with coming to Olympus if the two foreigners didn't intend to start something? Precautionary measures? From what? One was already a pantheonic threat. Plus, that would contradict their recent actions. What with taking in demigods, especially her little Annabeth, and risking to be put under the Olympians' watch? On the other hand, there was some merit to that theory. The Jade Emperor was still classified as a pantheonic threat as well, but curiously enough, the deity had not done anything to show for that title since the Heavenly War. It's almost like they're relying on their past reputations to put up a facade. Could the sage be doing the same? And could Amaterasu's disarming statements actually be an attempt to protect her supposed father, rather than avoid conflict with them? But more importantly, was she willing to take the risk of confronting the man? As confident as she was in a fight, if the sage was as powerful as his reputation suggested, then she deigns not to imagine a scenario in which she'd win. Sending a part of herself was an option, but if things go south, she'd need to be at full power. What then? Talk to the duo directly and ask them to go away. That could cause them to lash out, she thought. Talk to Zeus and hope he didn't overreact? You know he will, her mind supplied unhelpfully. She couldn't blame him, however. She was sure everyone but herself, Hestia, and possibly Hephaestus would have a pronounced reaction, especially Ares. As much as she'd want her brother to, as he'd say so crudely, get his shit pushed in, she'd prefer not to drag her entire family down with him in the process. Crocabam! The loud boom of Zeus' thunder echoed across Olympus, startling the three gods. What now? Athena shelved her thoughts and gestured for her siblings, who had been silently letting her think, to accompany her out. Hopefully, it wouldn't be what she feared. Connecticut, with Hades and Naruto's clone. Hee. Ryo-chan's got some pretty strong kiddos. Those were Naruto's thoughts as he saw a portion of the forest get vaporized by his opponent's flames. Good thing he lured the god some distance away from the house, even if he was sure the boss and his lady friend would still be feeling the ground shaking. As the clone resumed an exchange of blows with the deity, his thought drifted. The clone was more than pleased with Hades' performance so far. He'd be lying if he said he didn't expect a brute with a penchant for big flashy attacks, just like Yama, 7, had been. When it comes to the Taoist death god though, that giant tub of lard more than made up for his lackluster technique with a particularly annoying ability and monstrous reserves and durability. All of this made Yama almost as hard to fight as his brother Okwang. There was also the Shinigami or even the goddess Kali, 8, to consider, but the sage, for the life of him, could not recall ever seeing the two deities fight anyone, even if he knew for a fact that the first would have given him a run for his money while the other was just a smidge weaker than the freaking Trimurti. What with her ability to keep powerful demons like Mara, 9, imprisoned in Naraka, 10, most of the time. That bastard always slipped out somehow and tried causing trouble. But yeah, the crux of the matter was, the eldest of the big three was a pretty skilled and versatile fighter. He might not be showing the same power output as the aforementioned death gods, but Naruto knew he was restraining himself and controlling his attacks. If anything, that added to the stealthy fighting style he had adopted, one that the clone would have compared to a shinobi's. Yeah, the helm was annoying a bit. It messed with his senses by making the god almost undetectable by conventional means, but the sage was anything but conventional. Madara and those weird-ass clones of his gave Boss and Sasuke trouble back in the day. The clone reminisced briefly at the memory of his creator's first friend and surrogate brother. Boom. He was cut off by a massive shockwave, one that uprooted the very earth around them and forced the clone to backpedal. Naruto, do something, a voice identical to his spoke in mind. What now? Looking back, the blonde's eyes widened as he saw the fissures in the ground near closer to the house. Shit! The barrier would mean nothing if the entire cliff collapsed. Before he could do anything, his instinct screamed at him to block a violent thrust from Hades. One that was followed by an array of fireballs, which he blocked with a quickly hardened, mud wall. The god didn't give him any reprieve, pressing his advantage even more and forcing the clone back on the now cracked ground. Samahata cackled in his hand as each hit let her absorb a bit more of Hades' energy. Naruto doubted it'd do much good at this point though, since his opponent wasn't letting up his assault. The clone needed an opening. Or maybe he needed to stop playing around. Screw this, he thought with a bit of frustration. Strength! The blonde yelled. His body glowed a pale yellow, as he felt every muscle tense up and grow more powerful. With a roar, he reared back the blunt sword and used it to bat away Hades. The hit connected, it was blocked, and the god flew back, along with everything in the vicinity. A shockwave was created from the impact, one that uprooted the ground and the few remaining trees in front of Naruto, creating so much devastation that the forest now looked like a stone quarry. I overdid it, he looked to the side guiltily. I'm gonna have to replant this forest later. The clone did not dwell on the destruction he inadvertently caused through lack of restraint. Instead, his body glowed a dark green hue as he raised a foot and slammed it to the ground. Wood! He yelled again. This time, energy was released in a ripple that traveled through the entire forest and up to the cliff. Even with over half the forest burnt to the ground, the organic matter could still be used. With but a thought, Naruto had supercharged and commanded every bit of flora between him and the castellan home. Immediately, a thick root system formed in the ground, making its way through the cracked earth and holding its pieces together. In a few seconds, it reached the house, just as the latter began tilting back into the sea, and formed a solid wooden platform under it. It took at most 30 seconds for it all to happen, but the house was kept stabilized before it could be toppled. As opposed to spending a considerable amount of chakra to create an entire wooden structure from scratch, much like Hashirama would have done. Just using enough energy to connect to the appropriate domain for a few instants was a much better alternative. Yes, sir, great decision-making indeed. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the clone's inner self-congratulatory thoughts. So you can use other domains? Who know? What are you? The question came from Hades, who was creeping closer, looking no worse for wear, even if his armor was a bit dirted. So he finally took off that helm. The clone looked at his opponent for the first time and scrutinized his features. Wow. So Hestia ain't the only one that inherited good looks from her ma, thought the blonde. He wasn't surprised to see that the deity supported quite the handsome features, but didn't dwell much on it. From the looks of things, the god was re-evaluating his approach and walked calmly to the blonde. Maybe he was willing to talk things out? Just in case, Naruto mentally sent the original Naruto an inquiry on the progress. I'm almost done, no thanks to you, the original replied snidely. Oh come on! You said to distract him. I did, the clone complained. Your carelessness gave Ryuchan a scare, Naruto roared back. Ptaurigged, the clone relented. I'll stall a bit more then see if I can bring Deadman inside. You do that, the original agreed. Deciding to abandon the charade now that it wasn't needed anymore, and settle for the regular old Uzumaki charm, the clone grinned before connecting to the sound domain. The approaching god stopped in surprise when the man before him adopted a pose while the air around them carried the sound of kabuki music. I'm glad you asked? He yelled before raising a foot and jumping to the other, as a platform akin to a pedestal rose under him to elevate him. I'm the sage that hails from distant lands. He waved his hands around in rhythm with the tempo. Gifted with a terrific sense of humor, and the immortal wisdom of a hermit, I am the envy of men and women across the world, he said as he removed the tribal mask. I am. He paused for effect, while mentally connecting with yet another domain in preparation for the big finale. Uzumaki in Naruto, he announced with a massive shit-eating grin. Thunder boomed for an extra dramatic effect. Hypervi Sage, eat your heart out, thought the clone, referring to his long-deceased teacher. While his more questionable habits were a big no-no for the sage, the world needed Jiraiya's brand of eccentricity and showmanship. It was just too good to forget about. Silence reigned on the clearing after that, while the clone remained in the same position, his face frozen in his gleeful expression. Hades gazed at the spectacle blankly. Who? Naruto almost fell over from the shock. Oh, come on! It's me! You know, the sage heir from the east? The blonde pointed to himself with a surprised expression. The gallant sage of the east? Hades raised a brow. His question made the clone snap his hands into a pair of finger guns and wink at the black-haired deity. Are you up? That! Naruto heard Hades snort. Do you take me for a fool? Sure, you may have some skills, but your energy levels are honestly pathetic. The god sported a deadpan expression. The blonde jumped from his pedestal and marched towards the god, scowling all the while until he was up in the latter's face. Well, down under, since Hades was half a foot taller, so Naruto had to look up to meet the god's gaze. Out of pettiness, the clone willed a foot-tall pedestal to rise under him just so he could look down at the deity. You're cruising for a bruisin' boyo. Also, that's only 'cause I'm a clone. He pointed a finger accusingly at the death god. Hades once again raised a brow, both at the statement and the childishness of the blonde's antics. Ah? So I take it your original is the one messing with my curse? The god inquired. Yo, wait. That was your doing? Naruto yelled in Hades' face, prompting him to lean back, still sporting a deadpan expression. And what of it? You little brat. Do you have any idea what that poor woman is going through? Yes? That was the point of my curse. Naruto could practically feel the cheekiness in that tone. Oh ha ha ha. Boy, am I gonna enjoy knocking the lip out of ya. The clone waved a finger patronizingly in the god's face. I'm shaking in my boots, spoke Hades with a bored tone, seemingly unbothered by the lack of respect. Something tells me you don't believe me. Naruto narrowed his eyes at the god. No, really? Hades' answer dripped with mockery. This irritated the clone. Why, I oughta. Rumble. Huh? What now? Asked Naruto. Just as the clone finished the statement, the smell of ozone assaulted his nose. Something that the god before him also detected, since he uttered a brief curse and summoned a dark shield. Before Naruto could say anything, the area was struck by a massive bolt of lightning, and everything went white. Half-Blood Hill. What am I supposed to do in this situation? Thought the green-haired immortal. He stood at a somewhat safe distance from the goddess, who was still shielding herself with Greek fire, and rubbed his neck awkwardly as questions racked his brain. How long was Hestia going to do this? Why was she even doing this? And more importantly, why did this scene somehow feel familiar to him? Alright, think Zetsu. Did she get hurt on the way here? Unlikely he'd have felt any injury she'd sustained before she did. Did someone say something to her? Again, unlikely. Hestia didn't seem the type to get so upset over words. Unless they were vulgar. Ugh, the Uzumaki shuddered upon remembering the bitter taste of soap on his tongue. So what if his vocabulary was a bit colorful? Pops certainly didn't care, unless small children were around, and his siblings weren't any better. Except for Quatsi. But then again, his little sister's brand of abuse leaned toward a more physical approach. That's not even bringing up Amaterasu, who took the term roasting and applied it figuratively, and literally to everything and everyone that annoyed her. Actually, thinking about it, even his aunts and uncles weren't innocent of this, especially Shikaku and Kurama. His youngest and oldest uncles used to verbally assault each other at every opportunity before the rest of the family intervened. Something about Origuk's youth almost getting into a gang war through emulating their idols. Whatever. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. The only thing that could have made Hestia act like that would be their trip here. Did his stomach really smell that bad? Nah. He'd never gotten any complaints before. After all, it wasn't the first time he'd temporarily swallowed people. Oh. So it's about the Kronos incident. Huh? Wait, that doesn't explain it. Didn't it happen thousands of years ago? So why is she still hung up on it, thought the greenette. Zetsu just didn't get it. It happened. Hestia and her siblings got out of it fine. She should be moving on, right? He certainly did so. Even after the horrors of the Heavenly War, the Uzumaki had all but shrugged off the trauma and the memories of almost being killed several times. But Pops didn't, a part of his brain reminded him. Right. It was the whole reason behind creating Mole in Plain Sight to come here. Because his father was still hung up on the past and didn't want to repeat it. Zetsu, for his part, didn't care much anymore. They learned from the experience, and they kept moving forward. That's how he spent most of his life. Except. But I didn't do anything wrong, Pops. She started crying for no reason. Don't matter if there is a reason, Boyle, you need to fix it. But why? She'll get over it. I do. That's 'cause you got a strong attitude. But you need to understand, Zetsu-chan, you're the oldest. I don't get it. How does being born first saddle me with more responsibility? It's a rule of nature. Parents gotta look out for their kids, and older siblings look out for the younger ones. Your Uncle Kurama, as grumpy as he is, cares for all of us that way. Is that why he always yells at you? Bahaha. That's 'cause he wants people to think he's a tough guy. Truth is, your uncle is a huge softer that loves all his brothers and sisters, and that's why he's so protective of us. So what do I have to do? Hug them, support them, help them stand on their own feet. Just protect their smiles. That's your duty as the big brother. Yeah. Looking at the whimpering goddess, in Zetsu's mind's eye, her form was briefly overshadowed by the image of another deity. A young girl with black hair and amethyst tearful eyes, crying while holding on to something. Amachan, his mind supplied, remembering his little sister. Right. Pops didn't raise no bum. With a deep breath, Zetsu marched forward while inwardly chanting a mantra. First son, first son, first son. He got closer to Hestia, looked at his hands, and with a bit of reluctance, spread his arms out, before kneeling towards the goddess. First son, first son, first so-hhhgh, the Uzumaki screamed internally. Just like before, as he came into contact with the green flames, they spread out on his body and began eating away at him. First son. First son! He yelled internally and shakily brought his burning arms down towards Hestia's form. Hestia, for her part, was reliving memories she had long since buried. Her father's large hand grasping her small struggling form, his hot breath washing over her as his jaw opened to fit her entire body in, her mother's wails at the cruel betrayal, and lastly, the mute darkness that had choked her for days before she was joined by her. Since then, she had to suppress her own fear and act as a pillar of support for her family. Normal children would typically never remember the first few years of their lives. That wasn't the case for her. Hestia, even as a newborn, had inherited the gift of empathy from her mother. Just as emotions concerning specific events tended to anchor themselves in one's subconscious, the same phenomenon was magnified when it came to the goddess of family. In some ways, remembering so much about hers and her family's lives had both blessed and cursed her. She was able to forge an infinitely closer bond to her siblings, cousins, nephews, and the rest of their large family tree. She could truly help them and be the elder they all needed. Unfortunately, that meant enduring all the pain and hurt that came from their decisions, her father's actions chief among them. She could usually ignore it, as she had long since learned to shove it back into the deepest parts of her subconscious. But she still had specific triggers that could reel back those haunting memories onto the surface. Getting eaten again was among those. So she panicked. All rational thought had been put on the side burner. She'd let her instincts command her and lashed out. Hestia ag. A faint voice echoed in her mind as she retreated further into herself. Never again. Hestia. Snap ack. Snap out of it. The same voice echoed again, but she paid it no heed. She would never be subjected to this treatment again. Tia. Please. The voice sounded weaker than before. Why was it pleading? And why did it sound familiar? Suddenly, a small weight pressed against her, and a pair of things encircled her. Strangely enough, she felt no fear of it, quite the opposite. In fact, she ironically felt warmer. This was a hug, and quite the awkward one at that, her mind rationalized, what with all the trembling. Sistia, calm, and the voice was feeble, almost gone now. Who was this? What was the last thing she had been doing? Why was she trembling again? It hit her. Ish me. Oh, by Olympus! Her eyes relit as she blearily looked to the side, only to gasp as she saw her fellow immortal, barely holding on to her. Zetsu? Her flaming eyes flashed in recognition, and she dispelled her flames immediately. The Uzumaki fell forward, half his body crumbling into ash as the goddess cradled his already regenerating torso tenderly, and hugged him tightly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry! The deity couldn't help but cry at the greenette's state. She did this. She hurt him. Oh heavens! Oh, she was such a screw-up! She was. Pat pat. Zetsu coughed, and chuckled dryly at her surprised stare, his now healed palm resting on her soft brown locks. Heh. Glad to have you back, Sistia, the Uzumaki said with a small smile. She would have lashed out at the head pat had it not been for the relief that overtook her earlier fear. Zetsu would be okay. She'd be okay too. But she didn't want to let go for now. Hugs were nice. That's it for part 5. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.